At some point in your early life, you experienced a world event that defined your outlook on everything, be it the JFK assassination, the Challenger, Vietnam, 9/11, or the financial crisis. But for me and Gen Z, we got COVID-19, a virus that dashed any hope I ever had of going to university, but I probably wasn't going to anyway. It felt surreal watching this virus sweep the world, but since here in New Zealand we eliminated it after a few months, rather than a death toll, I observed a more psychological toll that took place on the people around me. So I wanted to explore 2 plague-based video games, examine the psychological effects of the plague on their world, and see just how accurate they were now that I had lived through a real epidemic in some incredibly formative years. Let's start with the big one, The Last of Us. The world of The Last of Us was turned completely upside down by cordyceps, with even the most pure-hearted person becoming tainted by their basest instinct. Every person in this world became their worst self, even if they didn't want to. The world forced them to turn to violence just to make it to the next sunrise. This is undoubtedly the bleaker of the plagues we're going to look at, and while it wasn't totally accurate to how things played out, I'm not going to call it unrealistic. See, COVID had a low mortality rate, so while you still avoided it like the literal plague it wasn't the end of the world if you got infected. Cordyceps is pretty cut and dry with how it works. You get bit, it's already over. It doesn't even have the mercy to kill you. It has to puppet you around, using you as a host to spread more fungus until your husk can no longer stand and you collapse and become part of the overgrowth. This means that the plague was taken as seriously as possible by everyone involved, though I am dying to see the first zombie media to pull the whole "people think the zombies are a hoax," but it's no surprise that the severity of the disease matches the severity of the response. This justifies the level of brutality we see in The Last of Us. If the cost of failure is the worst punishment imaginable, then there is no room for softness of any kind. You need to be at your most savage if you want to survive, and with that in mind, the collective insanity of the world makes sense. What's more, the zombies have been around for decades, and the world has not only adjusted but adapted to their threat. This means the hysteria and panic are over, and all that's left is the bitter longing for what once was. And who's to say that if a vaccine couldn't have been synthesized for COVID and more variants mutated, then who's to say that we wouldn't have ended up just like their world in 20 years? Next is a plague tale, and while this was a real-life plague, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that the tidal waves of rats are a slight embellishment of the truth to make the game more dramatic. This plague had a slightly different effect on people than cordyceps did, despite being no less deadly. Considering how poor the average person's immune system was at the time, instead of turning people violent and angry, the people of A Plague Tale seem to accept the hopelessness of their situation. You don't see people turn to crime or anger to survive, but they seem simply depressed about the epidemic instead of trying to fight back against it. Of course, there's no tangible threat to fight back against in this case, but it's still strange to see everyone so calm and morose about this apocalypse. I think the reason for this apathy might be because of the dominance of Christianity in this era. With the majority of people so sure that God exists and will save them from this plight, I can understand why people might not be fighting back, because they think they're going to be saved eventually. Of course, this is just the message the church is spreading to keep the peace and maintain order as more and more people fall ill. Due to the naivete of older generations, it makes sense that they would take what they're told at face value, especially if they believe it came from a higher power. The government in The Last of Us is set in the modern day with far more cynical denizens, so they rebelled when they exercised an overuse of authority. Despite what some truly misguided people believe, the head of state is not a holier-than-thou figure, so rebellion was justified. It would have also been correct for the Plague Tale people to rebel against the church, but what can you do when you've been lied to that a higher power is in control of your entire life? Technically it is, but that's the people in power, not any sort of god. Plagues are an awful thing to go through. My country objectively experienced the least amount of suffering, so I can't imagine what it was like for Americans, Brazilians, and Indians. While I was spared from the physical toll of the plague, the psychological one was all too apparent, as we all spent 6 weeks in a nationwide lockdown. The Last of Us and Plague Tale show two different sides of what happened to people affected by the plague, one that violently rebels and will always find a way to endure and survive, while another meekly accepts their fate as the destiny of some higher power. While neither of these is an excellent response to the threat of extinction, the desire to survive should always win out over accepting your helplessness. I'll be back in 2 days. In the meantime, here's a video comparing the effects of vengeance on the world in The Last of Us Part 2 and Dishonored.